The anodyne title of my talk is Dom Mocquereau's Rhythmic Theories. The official title of the talk is Why Dom Mocquereau's Rhythm is Worthy of Your Consideration and Dom Pothier's is not. And I actually, it seems like it's very contentious, and it's worth, before I even start, just reflecting on why is it that the rhythm of chant is contentious. And it's because rhythm is the most important part of chant. And in fact, rhythm is the most important part of all music. Without rhythm, there is no melody. Without rhythm, there is not really harmony. Because harmony is not just, a single chord forever, Terry Riley aside. Harmony requires motion. Motion requires ordered movement, and ordered movement is rhythm. So rhythm is the most important thing, and that's why it has elicited so much passion. It's such an interesting story, the fact that rhythm was just utterly controversial early in the Gregorian Restoration movement, the 19th century, early 20th century, and in fact remains controversial to this day. So before I start, I should just thank Jeff for allowing me to present what I think is sort of the other side of the coin. I'm basically going to do three things. I'm going to briefly address the legal status of the Solesmes markings, because Jeff has made some assertions about them that I actually mostly agree with, but I'm going to give the Solesmes side of the story just so you know where they're coming from, right? This guy, Dom Mocquereau, prior of Solesmes, really came off like kind of a disobedient jerk from Jeff's talk, right? I think that's probably not too strong. But he did not see himself that way. So I'm going to try to dispassionately present his side of the story and why he did the things he did. But I'm only going to do that for a few minutes, because secondly, what I want to do is to tell you where the Solesmes theory came from, where its big ideas came from. I identify three sources for them. They might be slightly surprising to you. And I also want to convey to you my deep respect for Dom Mocquereau as a music theorist, because I think he's actually really quite an interesting theorist. And then thirdly, I'm going to present 5 different ways that you might approach chant rhythm. One of them is going to be Pothier's rhythm, one of them is going to be Mocquereau's rhythm. My intention is to present what I know of each of them and what their motives are, and then to do them as best I can. I want to steel man all 5, leave you to decide. So that's the plan, and then I want to take questions at the end. So I'm hoping to squeeze that all in and not go too long, but we'll see. I am passionate about this topic. All right, so first, are the Solesmes rhythm signs licit? I do not dispute the fact that the Vatican edition, absent the dots and dashes and lines of the Solesmes books, is the official rhythm of the church. That is absolutely true. You should never feel bad about singing without the dots and dashes and lines. You are absolutely in conformity with the preface of the Vatican edition, with the wishes of the Pontifical Commission, with the wishes of St. Pius X, and that's all very good.
When did the Vatican edition come out?
Over several years, but the main books between 1905 and 1912. Okay. So I'm just going to present a few maybe mitigating facts. I may not convince you, and that's fine. As Jeff described, Pothier was a monk of Solesmes first. That was the monastery of his profession. He left in 1893 for political reasons that I think were not entirely musical, although who knows if the rivalry between him and his student Mocquereau might have been simmering below the surface. But this raises an interesting legal question. Pothier's work for the restoration of the chant was these wonderful books, the Graduale that he published in 1883, and then again in 1894 or 5 or whenever that was. Was that Dom Pothier's intellectual property, or was it the property of Solesmes? According to French civil law, it was Dom Pothier's intellectual property. According to the charter of the Benedictine order in France, it belonged to the Abbey of Solesmes. He had moved on to become first prior of Ligugé, or right, and then at Saint Mondrian. But his work belonged, according to monastic law, to Solesmes. So this created an issue when it came time for the Vatican to incorporate that in the Vatican edition, because they had made Pothier the president. Now, according to the monks of Solesmes, according to Mocquereau, they had a meeting before the commission first met. The monks of Solesmes had a meeting with His Holiness Pius X, at which they agreed to cede all rights to the intellectual property behind what became the Vatican edition. They gave them Pothier's books. They gave them the versions of the Graduale and the Antiphonale and all these things. And as part of that, they claim that they had an agreement, a verbal agreement with the Pope, that they would be continued to be allowed to print versions of the Vatican edition with signs added as a way to recoup their monetary losses from ceding the intellectual property of the melodies. That seems a little convoluted, but that is the main reason why Mocquereau did not consider his use of the rhythmic signs to be disobedient. He believed he had a higher authority, namely that of the Pope, who is, of course, the supreme legislator of the church. And Mocquereau is not the only one who attested to this meeting. Also, Father De Santi, who was an Italian Jesuit, also mentions the meeting, and this comes out in Kum's book. And I have sources there if you're interested, and I can send my slides around. But that for the monks of Solesmes, and especially for Dom Mocquereau, that changed the equation slightly, because they weren't necessarily being disobedient by adding these things to the Vatican edition, even though they contradicted the statements in the preface about the rhythm. So that's their side of the story. The part of the controversy is that the early version of the Solesmes signs, I know this is hard to read, I'm going to zoom in. The early version of the Solesmes signs actually touched the notes and changed the shape of the notes. So here's an Alleluia, and this is from the Liber Usualis, 1903, so pre-Vatican edition. This is Mocquereau's book. It's a familiar melody. Alleluia. On the beginning of the Ya, there's a podatus sub bipunctis, right? And then that sort of fuses with this cleves. And this is a variety of what we call the pressus, right? We haven't quite gotten to this stuff in the chant class, but a lot of you know it. The Solesmes way of singing the pressus is to accent it, to treat it, to fuse the two notes together and to sing it accented. That is true to this day. And so Mocquereau shows that with what became the ictus mark. But you see in this early version, it's actually touching the note. There's another one a little bit later on. That little line on the last diamond-shaped note there, that is the ictus mark. That became the vertical episema. And so when the early Solesmes versions of the Vatican edition came out in 1905, they included these ictus marks. This was the Kyriale, was the first book published. And so this was what was, this edition was seen as really problematic because it's literally changing the shape of the notes. And the Vatican edition had very strong, specific rules about how the notes were to be shaped. You had to conform to the wishes of the Vatican office in charge of this. So what they did, rather than getting rid of the ictus mark, which is possibly what they should have done if they were being truly obedient, is they just moved it slightly. So here's a book from just 5 years later, the beautiful Graduale. All of these are on the Corpus Christi Watershed website in the absolutely invaluable St. Jean Lalande Library of Rare Books, which you should all have bookmarked. But you see here, the ictus mark has migrated away from that rhombus and is now just below it, in the space below. And in fact, I think this is a major improvement in the Solesmes signs. And they were responding to a Vatican decree saying, well, you can't, your rhythmic signs are changing the notes, this is disallowed. So they just did, and moved them off of the notes. Now we're according to the letter of the decree, and we have this higher authority. So it's rather an interesting idea. Was it disobedient? I'll leave that up to you. Okay, but here's a quotation from Mocquereau that I think is somewhat important. He claimed that adding, here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to solve everything. That adding these little signs was less disruptive to the chant notation than transcribing it into eighth notes and quarter notes. Here's how he puts it. All the translations are mine. These slight modifications of the Gregorian notation were all the more acceptable since the Commission, informed of the reproductions in modern notation projected by several publishers, showed itself always willing to tolerate these attempts in spite of the important changes required by the transcription of the square notation in eighth notes, quarter notes, half notes, etc. In other words, how does this change the rhythm more than transcribing this as eighth note, 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 eighth note? I mean, you're literally changing the shape of the notes from squares to circles. You're adding stems, you're adding flags, you're taking those things that were little spaces and turning them into quarter notes. I mean, from Mocquereau's point of view, that's much more disruptive to the notation than the Solesmes signs, which don't affect the notes themselves. Again, I'm just giving you their side of the story. One more thing I want to mention. There's the Bishop of Verdun, his diocese published a book using the Solesmes signs. And the Vicar General was apparently somewhat not sure about this in light of the various controversies and Vatican decrees. And here's what he said. He says, last November, on 18th November, he met with the Pope. He says, Pius X assured us that the use of the rhythmical signs of the Solesmes school was by no means forbidden. His Eminence, Cardinal Mary Del Val, the author of our wonderful prayer this week, made the same declaration to us. It suffices that the text of the Vatican edition be unaltered. And by text here, he means what Jeff mentioned the other day, the musical text, the notes themselves. Now, Jeff will say that the Pope wasn't aware of all of the ins and outs of all this stuff. He did not think that Mocquereau was contradicting Pothier's rhythm. He thought Mocquereau was just making it clearer. I'm not going to read into the mind of a saint. I'll leave that to you. Mocquereau changed his mind about some things in light of the Vatican edition. So this is from a book, one of his Gregorian monographs from around the time that the Vatican edition came out. And what's interesting here is he shows 3 different ways of notating the same melody. This is from the Alleluia Ostende Nobis, which is the Alleluia for the first Sunday of Advent. It's a melody that happens some 20 times over the course of the gradual, so it's familiar to all of us. Alleluia. It's that one, okay? And he wrote a little book about this. And he gives the Editio Vaticana up top. There is precisely one melismatic mora vocis here. It's this one after this sol. And it goes, okay?
Beautiful, beautiful.
It is beautiful, yes. Here's what Mocquereau said it should be according to semiology. So the neumes here are a torculus, that's this little S. It's a standing up torculus. It's not, a normal torculus goes down, up, down. This one is kind of like rearing back, which means you slow down on it according to the semiology ideas. Then we have a climacus with a C written above for celeriter. Then we have a clevis with a C written above for celeriter. And then we have two clevises with episemata. Okay, so this clevis says go fast. These two say, well, they have something on them, which some people have interpreted as slowing down. So here's how he says it should go. And then in the middle, and I'm sorry, I did something wrong. I sang Pothier's Mora Vocis, right? So here's how Mocquereau says it should go. I'm reading the bottom one here. And in the middle, he gives what he calls the Vatican edition Solesmes, okay, which is published by De Clay. This is what the Liber Usualis is. It's basically the Vatican edition, but with the dots added. So he adds an episema over that torculus to show you that it goes a little slower. He got that from this one manuscript, St. Gall 359, and he threw the other 10,000 away. You decide whether that was worthy or not. He put an ictus here to show that the top note of this clevis is light. It belongs to a group that starts on the note before. He added the two episemas, da, 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 da. And then he added a dot. I know it's sort of hard to see in this reproduction, but he added a dot where Pothier's melismatic mora vocis was. He says, see, I did what I could, but I mostly was constrained by the shape of the neumes in the Vatican edition, out of obedience. So says Mocquereau. I have another longer example of that, but I'm going to skip it in the interest of time. But I'll go to the quote. Actually, we'll just take a look at the one spot that he wants to look at, which is this I'll sing his rhythm without getting into the details, but you see this is a little torculus, and then the last bit of the torculus has a little bit of a line drawn in. Yeah.
Putting your finger in it because I know the cursor.
Oh yeah, the cursor is like turned into a cross, which is so annoying. So right here, we have a torculus, and then instead of dots drawn after it, like you would have, say, over here, they're lines. You know, so either brother so-and-so's hand got tired, which is the Ostrowski theory, or it's meant to drag out in some fashion. And so Mocquereau says, you know, this is an important point, and that our rhythm should reflect this. So here's Mocquereau's rhythm. Okay, that's Mocquereau's reading of that one manuscript. The Vatican edition does not transcribe these that way. So they, this is the top row here. You would go right on through with perhaps some other nuances which we'll discuss later. So what is the Solemn Vatican edition do? It follows the note groupings of the official Vatican edition exactly and does what it can in reference to the markings. So from Mocquereau's point of view, the Solemn markings that we all know and which some of us love are a result of a compromise between his reading of the oldest manuscripts and the official text by which he was bound in obedience. So here's what he says about it. Some friends, struck by the beauty of this verse so rhythmed, the way I just sang it, said to me, why did you not indicate this rhythm in your editions of Tournai? Why not? Because the desire to closely follow the rhythm of the Vatican edition obliged us to neglect, in our reproduction with signs, several of the precious indications of the manuscripts. That's his attitude about the little semiology squiggles, precious indications. One must understand our reasons and to excuse this imperfection. Moreover, it is formally, here's what he says about the signs. It is formally understood that all the divergences pointed out remain for the moment in the field of archaeology and must be used practically only insofar as they can agree with the official notation. Does that sound disobedient to you? I'll leave that to you to decide. All right. There were 2 decrees in 1911 that spoke on this topic. They are quite different from each other. This is yet another example of the Holy See sending mixed signals, which has happened a few other times in recent history. It says, the reproduction of this typical edition containing the extra signs are abusively called rhythmical editions. They're abusively called that because, of course, the Vatican edition is a rhythmical edition. I do not dispute that fact. And as such, they have not been approved, but merely tolerated upon request. This toleration, under the circumstances, can no longer be admitted except for editions already made. Well, gee, that sounds like the Solemn markings are not allowed. Here's from April, 3 months later. Ordinaries in their own diocese may give the imprimatur to editions of these books made for Scholae Cantorum. So if it's a book that's made for a group that's studying chant together for the purpose of singing it, then you can give the imprimatur to it. And furnished with rhythmical signs, provided it is understood that the other regulations of the decree of the Congregation of Sacred Rites regarding the restoration of Gregorian chant have been observed. This is somewhat more, this second one is somewhat more permissive than the first one, because it basically says it's up to the local bishop. There's a book I read in preparation for this talk by a Monsignor Romita, who's actually a president of Pueri Cantores and later a member of the Sacred Congregation of Rites, and possibly one of the people that was on the good side in Sacrosanctum Concilium. And but his doctoral dissertation is called, what is it called? Jus Musicae Liturgicae. It is it's a Latin dissertation that I found a print copy of, and it's just about legislation pertaining to sacred music. As this person's doctoral dissertation, future member of the hierarchy. Here's what he said. He gives a full and precise, beautiful Latin account of all the different decrees, the order they came out in. He was the one who pointed out that the second one is more permissive than the first one. Here's his conclusion. My translation again. In practice, the rhythmic editions have buried these violent controversies, and they are not only tolerated, but altogether approved and used commonly by all, since they greatly facilitate the uniformity of the chant. That has been my experience as well. They make singing together a lot easier. Now, was Romita a squish? No, because if you read the section about whether females are allowed to sing at Mass, he says absolutely not. because it goes against the letter of such and such decrees and so on. So this is not a modernist, this is not a softie, this is a canon lawyer who later belonged to the SRC, and his idea is that the controversy is over because signs have been universally accepted. Well, what about today? Are we allowed to sing from them? There was a dubium, and you're going to enjoy the spelling, because this was by a Polish priest from about 4 years ago, and I think he ran it through an early beta version of Google Translate or something. It's rather special. But here's the question. This is one of his. He had a long list of dubia pertaining to the extraordinary form of the Mass, as it was then called. What he means, of course, is the less unique expression of the Roman Rite. He says, during the Mass, in the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite, Gregorian chants performed using a different method than the Solesmian, his spelling, method provided forth by the Graduale Romano in 1961 are acceptable. In particular, 1, the semiological method of Eugene Cardine's House, English semiology, Gregorian semiology, House Eugene Cardine. 2, singing method by Marcel Perez. This would be like our friend Bruno from the other night. Vocal technique based on Eastern, especially, I think that's my misspelling. I think he said Croatian. Practice used widely by Marcel Perez and his students. 3, using Graduale Romano 1908, omitting the rules and regulations regarding the technique of singing the Gregorian chant prescribed in the Graduale Romano. So, in other words, 3 possible ways to interpret the rhythm. 1, semiology. 2, Bruno. 3, pure editio Vaticana. Are these allowed? Answer, yes. Yep. So, in fact, we have been given permission to interpret the chant. Seemingly, I mean, right, there's a principle in canon law that when something is allowed, you read it broadly, right? So if I mean, this seems like a blanket approval of interpreting the chant, even using, I mean, Marcel Perez, they're not reading from the Editio Vaticana. They're reading their restored, I mean, it's quite different. Yeah.
Would you agree that number 3 is gibberish though? Because
absolutely, because as you have, I mean, as you are the person who's pointed out time and again, number 3 is actually the only one that is officially sanctioned by the church.
No, but I mean, he says omitting the rules and regulations. As a matter of fact,
there are none. Yeah,
they're in there, but then they give their own ones afterwards.
Yeah. So any Liber Usualis, the first thing in the book is the Vatican preface, which we've looked at and which we're going to look at again in a minute. The second thing is the rules for interpretation, which give all the little arsis and thesis curves and ictus marks and everything else. Now, the way that Liber introduces the Vatican edition, let's go to that. Here's what they say, these disobedient monks. The place of honor in this solemn edition of the Vatican official text is given to the Vatican preface. Its wise counsels and general principles of interpretation are embodied, elucidated, and enlarged upon in the rules given further on. Now, folks, this is nonsense, as our friend would say. Or this is gibberish. How do you put it so well? I mean, because they're not real. I mean, the idea that the solemn markings are elucidating Pothier, I think you have shown amply that they often contradict Pothier, right? They move where the pauses are. They really do. I will admit that. But they put a nice gloss on it here, right? They print the Vatican edition preface right at the front. They say it gets pride of place. Of course, pride of place is another loaded term that has been misused in other contexts. But the phrasing of the question shows, well, first off, it shows that this priest does not read Corpus Christi Watershed as much as he should, because if he did, he would know that asking about number 3 is nonsense, because of course, ignoring the rules and regulations in 1961, by which presumably he means the second part of the Liber introduction where they do their own stuff, I mean, not only is that allowed, the official rhythm of the church is certainly to read the Vatican edition, not disputed. But he's asking it in form of, are we allowed to do the official rhythm of the church? Okay, so if any of you has had a guilty conscience over singing the dots, singing the episemata, you're free. You're free to do so. And you should do so, let's think about it more as an aesthetic choice and less of a legalistic one. I do not dispute the facts that Jeff offered in his first night's talk, but maybe I convinced you of the solemn side. Did you have a question about this before I move on? Or
I was just going to ask you to remind me what PCED was.
Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei, now I think defunct and rolled into something else. So these Vatican alphabet soup offices come and go, don't they? Okay, so if it's an aesthetic choice, where does solemn come from? Because I am a great admirer of it, and an admirer of Dom Mocquereau in particular. As I was telling Jeff teasingly, I really do have a picture of Dom Mocquereau above my desk at home where I work. Okay, so let me present a little background on Solesmes, which I think might be of interest to us as musicians. Where does it come from? The first and most important source for Mocquereau's rhythmic theory is Dom Pothier. I strongly believe that. Pothier's interpretation of chant is one of free oratorical rhythm. We sing the chant like we speak it, and it's based on principles of classical rhetoric and oratory, and it's rather beautiful in that regard. If you look at Pothier's 1880 book, Les Mélodies Gregoriennes, which is wonderful but has unfortunately never been translated, he quotes Quintilian and Cicero more than just about anyone else on aspects of Latin grouping and grammar and pronunciation. And Guido d'Arezzo as well. Guido is the source for the term mora vocis, if you were wondering about that. I just want to pause here as an aside and say that God bless the Benedictine order and everything it's done for sacred music. From Saint Benedict and establishing the Psalter and the office and the way we do that, to Saint Gregory, the first Benedictine Pope, after whom what we do is named, to Guido d'Arezzo, inventor of the musical staff. I mean, how cool is that, right? That's huge. To Dom Pothier, Dom Guéranger, Dom Mocquereau. Pretty cool. So I think the first source for Mocquereau's ideas is Pothier, and I'm going to point a little bit of that out. The second source is the semiology stuff, the taking the two manuscripts and throwing out the other 10,000. I do not dispute that's what he did, but we'll talk about that in a bit. And three, trends in 19th century music theory. Now we're going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole, and I hope you come with me. Because I am a grad student in music theory right now. I'm passionate not only about chant, but also about music theory in general. And one of the things I have learned as a serious student of music theory is that everything you thought you knew was true has been controversial at some point in the history of music. Everything. So everything you learned as an undergraduate, everything your piano teacher told you when you were 10, everything you heard about reading music when you were 5 or whenever you started, everything that was ever given to you as just a fact has been controversial at some point in history. Let me give you an example. There are two ways to think about musical meter. I'm borrowing some terminology here from my dissertation advisor, William Rothstein. He talks about departure meter and arrival meter. Departure meter is what I teach when I have to teach an introductory level music theory class or ear training class or intro to reading music class, which I do for freshmen. Departure meter goes something like this. This is from a textbook that I've actually taught from at a university. I'll just read it. In music, the first beat of each measure is normally the strongest and is given an accent. The repeating pattern of strong beats followed by weaker beats is called the metric accent. Simple meter. When the top number of the time signatures is a 2, 3, or 4, this is called simple meter. In simple meter, the pulse note is divided into 2 or 4 equal parts. Count and clap the following rhythms in simple meter. So we have our 2/4 bar. We've got the 1 is given in a big typeface. We have 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And there's an accent mark under each one. This is departure meter. This is saying that the accent comes from a series of beats, the first of which is strong, and all the following ones which are weak. This is one of these things that you might have been told at some point in your life was true, and which has actually been a source of insanely fierce controversy. There's a whole other tradition of something called arrival meter. Arrival meter is where the downbeat comes at the end of something. So this is from an actual book by this author, Jérôme Joseph de Montmagny. And here's what he called his book, which tells you something about the ego of music theorists. He says, his book is entitled, The Only True Theory of Music. And here's what he says. Here's how he counts 2/4. He gives a little scale, and I'm going to conduct. So you could imagine we've worked on conducting patterns. If you're trying to learn the simple 2 pattern from Dr. Calabrese, close your eyes. Because here's what he says. We go downbeat, upbeat, downbeat, upbeat, right? And he counts it like this. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. What's wrong with that? It's backwards. Yeah, it's literally backwards. Yeah, people did not agree. And this is the opposite of this, right? But wait a minute, this book is called The Only True Theory of Music. This one is even more interesting. Basically, any big beat, like a downbeat or a long beat or anything like that, is the end of a group for this guy. That's the way he hears music. He hears it as the end. So here we have this melody. If I conduct again, I might not be able to do this. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Doesn't it act like it's kind of convincing, right? I happen to admit that I subscribe to this arrival meter thing. Never turn this in to a freshman, label the beats assignment, because I will fail you. But it makes a certain amount of sense, especially if you're French, or especially if you're Italian, right? Or if the music that you grew up with was Italian opera, right? I mean, Italian opera is also oriented towards the end of every line, which is known as the accento comune, right? So why should we start counting from a strong beat and then imagine everything after that is weak? Maybe the strong beat is the one that comes at the end. But it wasn't just Italian and French. Here's Ugo Riemann, who is widely considered one of the most important music theorists of all time, maybe after Boethius, Sarlino, Rameau, and if you're a certain kind of a North American music theorist, Heinrich Schenker. But Riemann is big, and obviously German. And here's what he says. Here's how he says an 8-bar phrase goes. Da-dum, da-dum, that's strong. Second measure. Da-dum, da-dum, fourth measure strong. Weak, strong, sixth measure strong. Weak, strong, eighth measure strongest. And that this works reiteratively at higher and higher levels, so that the first measure in its entirety is weaker than the second measure. The third measure is weaker than the fourth measure, and so on. And it works at a higher level still, where the first two measures are weaker than the second two measures. And measures 5 and 6 are weaker than measures 7 and 8. And if it's divided into two subphrases, what we would call antecedent and consequent, that the first one is weaker than the second one. Does anyone actually hear music this way? Yeah, I think maybe they do. Take an example like the slow movement Beethoven 7. Which beats are strong, which beats are weak? You know, it's not so obvious, right? You can go to the piano for a second. Is it strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak? Or is it the opposite? Is it weak, strong, strong, weak, strong? Could be either one, right? Why is it one and not the other? Does it depend on, are you German, are you French? Maybe it does. Did you grow up listening to a lot of opera? Did you grow up listening to a lot of Solesmes edition Gregorian chant? Or did you grow up listening to German folk songs, in which case you might take the other option? So everything you thought you knew has been controversial. Mocquereau corresponded with Riemann. There are 21 letters between them that are in the archive at Solesmes. I'm looking at them next month when I go to Solesmes. No one's ever published them or translated them or anything. I don't know what's in there. Another person that Mocquereau corresponded with was the cantankerous, famous composer and teacher Vincent d'Indy. Here's from d'Indy's book. He says, this is the basic rhythmic unit. A light time followed by a heavy time. The heavy time gets extra weight. d'Indy says, this is not necessarily loud. It's just heavy. Here's Mocquereau's basic rhythmic unit. You might have seen this before. It's an arsis and a thesis. The arsis goes into the thesis. There's élan and repose. There's activity and rest. Rise and fall. And the accent does not necessarily correspond with the fall for Mocquereau. It's often on the rise, even though that's the upbeat. d'Indy used this to analyze Beethoven. We were talking about Beethoven's Fifth briefly earlier. Here's how d'Indy analyzes it. This is the beginning of the slow movement. You probably know the tune. Right? Here's how he analyzes it. He says the first group lands on this downbeat, the F. And it's got a part that's light and a part that's heavy. Da da light, da 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 heavy. Okay? And then the second half is similar. It's got a part that's light and a heavy. Da 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 light, da 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 da. So imagine this lightness and heaviness. I'm going to show it just with a little bit of chironomy. Ya da dum da di da da dum da 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 di da 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 dum. And then here's the kicker. Where's the strong syllable? Where's the strong accent? d'Indy says that the tonic accent is on the high C in the first part and the high D in the second part. And that those are light, lifted, and accented. So now I'm going to try to put those three ideas together with the chironomy. Ya da dum da di da da dum Does that seem backwards to you? Maybe it does. Everything you thought you knew has been controversial. So the basic idea of Solesmes is made in conjunction with Dandy, with Riemann, with Mocquereau, with this arrival idea, that the strong syllable in chant is often on the upward part, and that the weak syllable often corresponds with the length, the weight, the arrival. Seems counterintuitive at first, doesn't it? So here's a chant. This is the first line of a communion chant. It's from one of the Sundays after Pentecost. I can't remember which. Memento verbi tui servo tuo nomine. Or if we're going to follow, you can imagine it without the dots if they make you feel uncomfortable. The point here is we get these words like verbi, tui, servo. Each of them has two notes on the weak final syllable and one note on the first one, okay? How are you going to reckon that? Are you going to try to feel the strong syllables as the downbeats? Mocquereau says that that's bad. He says this is mauvais, that means bad. Right? He writes, he bars it as though the strong syllables are going to be on all the downbeats. Memento verbi tui servo tuo domine. He says that is bad because it makes it too syncopated, it's too weird. I admit it's a little jazzy, right? But imagine it again. I'm gonna just try to feel those downbeats as I sing it. Memento verbi tui servo tuo domine. Mocquereau says, contrary to that actually it's the two notes that belong in the downbeat and the one note that is accented, light, lifted, and a pickup. So he bars it like this. He says this is good. Memento verbi tui servo tuo domine. And there you have it. That's the Solesmes rhythm. The weak final syllable gets the ictus, that is to say it's the downbeat, but the downbeat is not accented. It is a weak, long arrival after an energetic, light, lifted upbeat. I'm going to sing it one more time so you get that. Memento verbi tui servo tuo domine. I don't know what you think of that, but I think it's quite beautiful and worthy of your consideration. But it's a little counterintuitive, right? Because it means that we're imagining downbeats on weak syllables. But that's part of the plan. It's a feature and not a bug. All right. So, if it's an aesthetic choice, what are 5 ways that you might sing chant rhythm? Well, all 5 of the ways I'm going to describe, they say that their main point is to properly pronounce Latin, right? That is the starting point for all of these. It's the starting point for what I call proto-mensuralism. This is what they did in the 19th century before Solesmes. It's the starting point for the Vatican edition official rhythm. It's the starting point for the Solesmes method. It's the starting point for semiology, and it's the starting point for mensuralism. All of them claim to be attempting to sing the chant rhythmically in a way that most respects the pronunciation of Latin. Well, why are they all different? Because Latin is a dead language, and we don't really know how, because you can come, it's not to say we don't know how it should be pronounced, it's that you can easily come to different conclusions about this in good faith. Proto-mensuralism. We owe this to a bunch of books, but in particular, this book, Directorium Chori from 1582 by Giovanni Guidetti. This stayed in print for some 3 centuries. This is actually, I took this from the version published by, in the 19th century by Pustet. And he says that notes in Plainchant come in 3 forms: square, diamond, tailed note. We would think of this as punctum, rhombus, and virga. He says, ordinarily, The diamond note is called the semibreve, and it's a small beat. It fits, the two of them fit in the space of a breve, and the long is the one with the tail. Okay, so let's take a look at a melody that we all know. This is going to be the one I'm going to sing. Which notes get long here? The tail note on fa gets long, and then the tus that comes after is short. The note at the end of nobis, the note at the end of e, followed by a short note on d. This is long, and this is long. All right, so I'm going to sing this in the most beautiful way I can, following that. Christus factus est pro nobis, obediens usque ad mortem. I don't hate it, honestly. That's the idea. It's very simple. This got published again. Notice the melodies get progressively more butchered. So here's the Medicean edition. This was the official rhythm of the Catholic Church before there was an official rhythm of the Catholic Church, because this was published, at the behest of the Council of Trent and various people. Notice they just shorten everything. And here, the rhythm starts to get rather ugly. Christus factus est. Oh, I should add that when a tailed note is followed by a square here, they mean that to be like a diamond, we think. I don't want to get into the weeds with that. But then following. Pro nobis, obediens usque ad mortem. Here's the same melody as published with the official, this is what came before the Vatican edition. This is why we needed the Vatican edition. This was a 19th century edition. It's also just, I have to say, kind of ugly compared to the typeface that Pothier came up with, which is just so much more elegant and human looking. I won't sing this. Yeah.
Have you taken the time to compare those Costa editions from 1891, 1895, 1900?
No.
They changed quite a bit.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly why, but they changed quite a bit, and towards the end they
Yeah.
took out almost all the rods.
That's really
So
interesting.
it might be worth looking at.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if he was influenced by political concerns.
But I mean, take the first one and compare it to by the time you get 40 years later,
Yeah.
it's quite different.
Yeah, that's really
In
interesting.
the shapes. Yeah.
Pothier rhythm. We've been over some of this. I think there are some nuances in the Vatican edition rules that we've never really spent time on, and I want to kind of explore them. So I've listed all the things from the Vatican edition rules that I think might pertain to rhythm. One, and the numbers that follow are the rule numbers in the preface. I won't get bogged down, I promise. It says 1, the stropicus and pressus are held, but the pressus gets more intensity or tremolo. Interesting. The note before the quilisma may get a sharper impulse. Well, what the heck does that mean? A sharper impulse? Does that mean it's longer? Does that mean you sing sharp? I think it might mean length. Okay, but here's the thing. He uses the sharper impulse again in the next rule. He says, the first note of the clivis, porrectus, and climacus, the tail note, gets a stronger impulse. Well, wait, is that one longer? Because that would be kind of wild, right? Then the neumes should be audibly marked off from each other. This is what he calls the mora vocis. He uses it rather more generally than, we've been focusing on the ones that come in the middle of melismas, but for Pothier, if you read his book, there are several levels of mora vocis. There's the mora vocis that happens after every neume, and it's tiny and probably inaudible. There's a slightly larger mora vocis that happens at the end of every word. There are longer mora voces that happen at the end of a phrase, or a longer phrase, or a sentence, or a paragraph, or a piece. The longest mora vocis of all is the one that happens at the end of a piece. And so there are quite a great number of gradations of this, and he's getting this from Guido d'Arezzo, who invented not only the staff, but also the mora vocis. Yay! So he gets into those. Rule 5, follow the accent and rhythm of the words. Okay, well, we've already seen, or we're about to see, that no one agrees about what that means. No numer note unduly lengthened or prolonged. Okay, so here's a question I want to raise about the official Vatican rhythm. When he says a stronger impulse on the beginning of those neumes, does he mean longer? Well, let's go to President Pothier's precedents. So here's his book from 1580, Les Mélodies Gregoriennes. He says, in number 3, this climacus starts with 2 short notes and finishes with a long. Et regeo. That the beginning of this the beginning of this climacus is short. But that this one, number 4, here's what he says. On the contrary, it begins with a long note and finishes with 2 shorts, as in number 4. Usque in aeternum. Wait, that should be long? According to Pothier, yes. Why should it be long? Because it's higher than the note before it. If the climacus is higher than the note before it, then it should start with a long. So says Pothier. Number 2, the porrectus. It's composed of 2 short. It can be composed of 2 short notes followed by a long. That's in omnes chantas. There, the last one is long because it's the end of a word. Omnes chantas. But here's vita. This is the beginning. This is from the Salve Regina. He says that this one is long followed by 2 shorts because it's the beginning of a phrase. Vita. Not vita, but vita. There's some length there, according to Pothier. So is that what Rule 6 means in the Vatican edition? Well, let's take a look at another climacus. He says, look at this note of this descending series of 4 notes. Seculorum amen. He says, the final formula, that's his word for the neume, in this example, should be sung giving a light impulsion of the voice on the note fa. So, seculorum amen. There's a little impulse on the without, however, prolonging. So the F is not long. In this formula for the rest, there are 2 long notes, sol and re. So this note is a climacus. It's higher than the stuff that came before. Therefore, we lengthen it. So the sol and the re are long. The fa and the mi are short. And he says we could write this like modern notes as breve, semi-breve, semi-breve, breve. So here's how Pothier says to sing this in his 1880 book. Seculorum amen. Is that what Rule 6 of the Vatican edition means? Stronger impulse? I don't know. Should we look at Pothier's precedents? Probably. Okay, so maybe we should be lengthening certain tailed notes if they're high. So I'm going to sing the same thing from the Vatican edition to the best of my ability. Christus factus est pro nobis, obediens, usque ad mortem, mortem autem crucis. So maybe I missed a melismatic mora, I don't know. I didn't put my laptop down by my nose. But I did my best. And I think it's very beautiful. And I think it's really gorgeous. I respect it. But notice that I did take the liberty of lengthening a few of these things because they are tailed notes that are high. And he does say that. Okay, so Solesmes.
It's quite beautiful if you go on where that high part, it's different in his.
Okay, well
Really nice.
I wish we had time,
Let's
but
sing it for the next
yeah.
6 hours.
Okay, so Solesmes. You all know this. Just review it. There's a hierarchy of phrase structures. The whole chant is viewed as a kind of architecture. Smaller divisions are shown with a more vocis dot. On the smallest level, everything is a pickup to a downbeat. Often the accent comes on the pickup. It's counterintuitive, but that's why we get credo in unum Deum. It's not accented wrong, it's by design. The accents are not where the footfalls are. I'm going to say that again. The ictus does not equate with accent.
The ictus does not equate with accent.
Good, it's important. Certain rhythmic signs are added from the manuscripts. I admit, he looked at more than 2 manuscripts, to be fair. He was really, really instrumental in all the good work that happened with the Gregorian restoration. But he did favor manuscripts from St. Gall and Laon. Absolutely true. The way Jeff put it the other day was I thought, really interesting and good. Why should I read this book? Because it's within reach. I don't need a ladder to get it, right? Do you remember that?
Yes.
But what if the book that's within reach is the only book that has information on a particular topic? Then maybe it is more germane. Something from my past. So before I got into sacred music, I played guitar. And when I was a kid, the way you learned guitar was you looked at tabs online. They were drawn like with ASCII characters, and they would show you the, how to play a song that you wanted to learn. They usually don't include rhythm. Why not? For the same reason that the semiology signs don't include rhythm. Because you already know how the song goes. You just want to learn the finger picking pattern. You've heard the song, you can get the rhythm. But what if there were 2 websites on the entire internet where they very carefully put some rhythmic indications in? They drew bar lines, they drew rhythms above the staff to show you the rhythms. Well, maybe those are more valuable than the tabs that you found on Yahoo or Lycos or one of those search engines. I'm betraying my age here. Okay, there are particular neumes that are interpreted with certain rhythms. So the quilisma is interpreted rhythmically. We lengthen the note before, sometimes 2 notes before. The long note, the salicus, the middle note is lengthened and so on. And there are a couple others. The main idea, arsis, thesis, upbeat, downbeat, accent, heavy. Elan, repose. Counterintuitive, beautiful. I'm going to skip this. But I just wanted to point out that a lot of, we'll do this, okay. So Solesmes would put an ictus here, and sorry, I know it's not showing up, right? Ictus, 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 ictus. Everything's 2, right? Sorry. That's, what is it, Gloria 9 or something, right? Well, hey, they just divided up that neume. That's a climacus, that we should be singing that as one gesture. Well, here's how they say to do it. You should sing it as 2 neumes. We would write it just as if it were 2 neumes. We divide this 4-note neume into 2. Well, where am I getting that? Pothier. Yep. He was a monk of Solesmes, after all. Okay, so let me sing a la Solesmes, the first part of Christus Factus Est, to the best of my ability. You tell me how different it is from Pothier's, honestly. Christus factus est pro nobis, obedienzosque ad maudam Disobedient? You decide. Okay, semiology. We went over this, Jeff went over it in great detail last night. I don't disagree with a lot of it. I will say that Dom Pothier, who's the founder of the semiology school, he did not think it should be a system. You should look up a document, if you're interested in this, called Dom Potier's Last Testament, or something like Last Will and Testament.
It's right in front of me. It's underneath that book.
There you go. He said that it should not be a system. This is not a method. It's not a new Solesmes method. So, you know, it gives free range to people like Bruno and Father Ruff. There are three main rules of semiology. One, they all say this: pay attention to the words. Well, gee, have we heard that before? It seems like all the other three schools we've looked at said to pay attention to the words. Particularly, attention to the division between words and the rhetorical groupings of phrases and clauses. I did a phone interview with Ed Schaefer for my dissertation, and I asked him to sell me on semiology, and this is what he said: we pay attention to the rhetorical groupings of phrases and clauses. Well, gee, everyone's been doing that since the 16th century. I mean, literally no one is saying about chant that we should not pay attention to the words. Careful attention to every aspect of the rhythmic manuscripts, namely St. Gall and Laon, which are read as creating unmeasured rhythmic nuances. And then in particular, and this is the thing that's new in Cardine, if the pen was lifted, we do something rhythmic. So, something is drawn, and it involved lifting up the pen and starting the neum again, that's treated with some kind of rhythmic importance. Maybe his hand got tired. Anyway, this is from that website, Gregor und Taube. Notice they've changed the melody somewhat because they think the Vatican edition, talk about disobedient. But anyway, but we're allowed to, okay? The now defunct Ecclesia Dei Commission has said so. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sing this. I've read Cardine's books, I've read Augustini's book. I'm going to try to follow what they say. I'm going to sing this to the best of my ability. You decide. Christus factus est pro nobis, obediens usque ad mortem maudem cruci It's subtle, the differences. It's not, I don't know. It's not my favorite. The last one we'll look at is somewhat more radical school, but worth addressing because they have been around since the beginning. And these are people who interpret these, they do the same manuscripts, the same St. Gall neumes, but they interpret notes that should be long as exactly twice as long, right? So they think there's a measured proportion between them. This is known as mensuralism. They believe that the relationship between these is measured. In particular, this is a point I brought up in my class the other day. How did they measure time in the Middle Ages? They did not have clocks that even had minute hands, okay? They did not have metronomes. There's one really interesting treatise from the 14th century where they're trying to say how fast something goes, and they say, well, take the day and divide that into 12 hours, and then divide each of those hours into 60 instants, and then each instant into 20 moments. And I think that, the length of a breve is like 2 moments or something. They really go through this level of detail because they have no fixed measure of time shorter than the day. So the way they talked about short durations of time, and you can find this in St. Augustine, there's a wonderful passage in the Confessions near the end about this. The way they talked about it was by poetry. And if you know anything about classical poetry, you know it has long and short syllables. And Augustine says somewhere that, the long syllable is twice the value of the short syllable. And this idea gets picked up throughout the Middle Ages, so that the long is twice the length of the breve. This is a world without metronomes, but according to this mensuralist school, and they seem to be, they just will not go away. It's like the zombie rhythmic theory of chant in the 20th century. They believe that the longs should be twice as long as the shorts. So 2 rhythmic values, longs twice as long as the shorts. The drawback here is that it can sound very, very heavy and weighted. So I'm going to try to put the best light on this that I can. This is from Dom Gregory Murray's book, which is on the CC Watershed site.
Christus factus est pro nobis obediens osque ad mortem autem
No one likes mensuralism, but I have to say, I've been listening to if you're interested in this, listen to the recordings by John Blackley. They're kind of interesting, and they it takes a lot of getting used to. I'll say that, but it's an option. All right, so those are the 5 options. I don't know if you wanted if this were a YouTube video, I would do 5 ways of singing Gregorian chant ranked. And I would do Solesmes, Pothier, semiology, proto-mensuralism, mensuralism. That would be my ranking. Jeff's ranking would be different, but we shouldn't lose sight of the big picture. So I want to end with 2 kind of concluding thoughts, really in the spirit of Richard's beautiful talk. One from Dom Pothier and one from Dom Mocquereau. So here's what Pothier, this is the ending of his 1880 book, my translation. Let us put our souls in unison with our voices, according to the word of Saint Benedict in his rule, mens nostra concordet voci nostra. Let us pray and sing with humility, love, and reverence, in compunction of heart and fear of the Lord, in fervor of spirit and ardor of holy desires. May we be lifted by song, and as if already transported to heaven, we contemplate the divine mysteries in sweetness and purity of feeling, in holy animation and joyful gravity of devotion, in the sweetness of melody and the intoxication of jubilation, so that in the midst of the concert of voices and the transports of an ineffable joy, we bless God our Creator, so that one day, being risen among the saints, we may praise him with them, him who called us, and triumph in the eternal joy where he lives and reigns forever and ever. Amen. Here's Dom Mocquereau's conclusion to a speech he gave in 1896 that I also have taken great inspiration from over the years. Art then is necessary, but as I have already said, it is not sufficient in itself. To sing the chant as it should be sung, the soul must be suitably disposed. The chant should vibrate with soul, ordered, calm, disciplined, passionless, a soul that is mistress of itself, intelligent and in possession of the light, upright in the sight of God and overflowing with charity. To such a soul, gentlemen, add a beautiful voice, well trained, and the singing of those hallowed melodies will be a finished work of beauty, the music of which Plato dreamed, a music which inspires a love of virtue. Nay, more, you will have the ideal of Christian prayer as Saint Denis understood it. The realization of the great Benedictine motto, Mens nostra concordat voci nostrae. Let our mind concord with our voice in the praise of God. Thank you. So I don't know how you feel. I could take a couple questions. I know it's a contentious topic, or we could just give Mocquereau the last word. Yeah.
It was kind of a general, but all these PowerPoints, are these going to be on CCA Watership, all these slides?
Yeah, I don't know if mine's going to be allowed. You might have to go off site for this contraband. But yeah, I'll happily share my slides. It's not PowerPoint. This is made in LaTeX. Yeah.
I would love to give Dom Pothier the last word, but I wanted to ask, I was thinking about having gone to the Ward method, how faithfully do you think Justine Ward's, or the method that she put forth, which was pretty faithful, I think, to Dom Pothier, got distilled? How, is it Solesmes? Is it Solem? I mean, is it Dom Pothier? Is it?
So, I know Jeff has strong feelings about this too. So Justine Ward, if you don't know, she's rather an interesting character. She was an American woman, and she read Tra le Sollecitudine, which is the motu proprio from 1903 that was kind of the impetus behind the Vatican edition and the reforms. And it caused her to convert to Catholicism. And she was incredibly wealthy and decided that she read some of Mocquereau's books and got interested in teaching, and so she started teaching chant to children using what she thought was Mocquereau's methods. At one point, she invites Mocquereau to the United States, and he comes and he sees her, and she conducts, and he basically tells her, "What you're doing is not my method. You've completely misunderstood me." It's like that Woody Allen scene where Marshall McLuhan comes out, and it's like, how you came to teach a class of anything? No, it's so she. But she ended up spending a great deal of time at Solesmes, studying with Mocquereau, corresponding with him, and then after his death with Dom Gajard, who was his pupil. So I think she's the best she can be, and I take some inspiration from her books. As to how faithful they are, I don't know. I mean, it's a complicated subject, and I don't know how faithful any of us are. I mean, it's like, I think in all these talks we've learned, it's like communicating any information about this stuff is fraught with difficulty and the possibility of misunderstanding. She believed she was being faithful. I know Gajard read many of the books before they were published, so they're probably pretty close. I certainly count them among Solesmes method writ large. Yeah.
What was the lady's name?
Justine Ward, W-A-R-D. And the Ward method it incorporates the Arsis and Thesis stuff and uses it in conjunction with folk songs, and it's designed to be incorporated into like a Catholic school curriculum. And some people still use it to this day. I have used it in the past. I no longer use it with my children's schola, but my wife does a little bit of Word method stuff. I kind of adapted. Yeah.
Did you find something better than the Word method?
This last year I used the Sunyol textbook with my kids, which I thought was quite good. That's the one that I mentioned at the chant talk today.
Something's happening on your screen.
Oh, that's okay. Acrobat Reader, it's going haywire. Thank you.
Okay, and compare the Sunyol to the Word. So the Sunyol, is it slightly better, or just you liking experimenting a different way?
I was just trying something different. Sunyol was originally written in Catalan, but Sunyol is much more widespread within this kind of Solesmes sphere. All of them are a little different, right? I mean, Mocquereau's book, his big magnum opus is Le Nombre Musical Gregorian, 2 volumes, totaling some 1,500 pages. So it's quite easy to be slightly unfaithful to something if you don't have instant recall of every little aspect of his ideas.
How is Sunyol spelled?
S-U-N with a tilde O-L.
Spanish and
He was a monk of Montserrat. Well, come on, we just had rhythm wars. I'm surprised there's not, It's not shouting each other down like the English Parliament. Yeah.
Maybe this would be a better question for Jeff, but I'll ask you. So is there anywhere an agreement of how to actually sing the Vatican rhythm, the official, like, because you mentioned the tail note could be maybe be held or maybe not.
I think Jeff is probably, I mean, Jeff seems to be the majority opinion because, I mean, look at all those books he always mentioned, the Schwann edition and Mecklin and all these other ones. They never do anything like what I was talking about. I'm just getting that from Pothier's book. So I'm a little bit poking fun at it, but does anyone agree about anything? I mean, no one even agrees how to sing the Solesmes rhythm, so I don't know. Disagreement can be healthy because it means that we care. And we care because, like I said, it's important. Melody without rhythm is dead, just like a human without a pulse is dead.
Looks like you answered everything.
Okay, thank you so much.